The radio crackled with static, then nothing. Just the empty hiss of dead air where Sergeant Katia Muranov's voice should have been. The forward air controller in the observation post pressed his headset tighter against his skull, as if pressure alone could resurrect her signal. Behind him, three Marines stopped mid-conversation, their eyes fixed on the tactical display showing a single blue icon frozen over hostile territory. The A-10 Thunderbolt had been circling a valley in Helmand Province, providing close air support for a convoy pinned down by insurgent fire. Then silence, the kind of silence that makes experienced soldiers stop breathing. Katia had checked in 14 minutes ago with her usual clipped efficiency. Hog 27, 30 Mike hot, 1 pass northeast to southwest. Her voice carried no emotion, just the mechanical precision of someone who had made this run 100 times before. The controller had rogered her transmission, watched her icon descend toward the canyon floor, and waited for the familiar thunder of her GAU-8 Avenger cannon tearing through the morning air. It never came. Instead, the radio went silent, and that blue icon simply stopped moving. In the operations center 16 miles away, Major Collins leaned over the communications desk, his jaw tight. Around him, the organized chaos of combat operations continued, screens flickering with drone feeds, officers coordinating artillery strikes, radio men cycling through frequencies. But a pocket of stillness had formed around the A-10's channel. Everyone who knew anything about close air support understood what radio silence meant at low altitude over hostile terrain. It meant catastrophic systems failure. It meant pilot incapacitation. It meant the aircraft was already a smoking crater in some nameless Afghan mountainside. Collins had flown with Muranov during her first deployment. Back then, she was Lieutenant Muranov, fresh from Moody Air Force Base with her wings still shiny and her call sign not yet earned. The other pilots had called her Bookworm because she studied technical manuals like scripture and asked too many questions during briefings. Some of the old guard had questioned whether she had the instinct for low-altitude combat, whether she could make the split-second decisions that kept Warthog pilots alive when they were dancing with the terrain at 300 knots. Collins had vouched for her anyway, seen something in the way she handled the aircraft during training runs, a kind of communion between pilot and machine that couldn't be taught. Now her aircraft was silent somewhere over Taliban-controlled territory, and Collins was calculating how long it would take to scramble a search and rescue operation. He checked his watch. 16 minutes since last contact. In combat operations, 16 minutes was either nothing or forever. The controller's voice cut through the operations center. "Sir, I've got, wait." He adjusted his frequency, head cocked. "Sir, I'm getting something." It wasn't Muranov's voice. It was her aircraft. The sound came through garbled and distant, but unmistakable. The distinctive buzzsaw roar of the GAU-8 cannon, 7 barrels rotating at 4,000 rounds per minute, spitting 30mm shells downrange. The acoustic signature was being picked up by ground microphones near the convoy's position. She was still in the fight. But why hadn't she responded on radio? The forward air controller tried again. Hog 27 authenticate. Nothing, just static. Then through the white noise, a sound that made everyone in the operations center lean forward. Not words, not even a voice, just breathing. Labored, wet breathing punctuated by a sound like someone trying to swallow through a crushed windpipe. Collins grabbed the microphone. "Katia, if you can hear me, don't try to talk. Key your mic twice for yes." 5 seconds of silence stretched into geological time. Then 2 distinct clicks cut through the static. She was alive, conscious, and she was still flying. Tactical display updated. Her icon was moving again, but wrong. The flight path was erratic, gaining altitude in jerky increments like a drunk person climbing stairs. Collins pulled up the telemetry data streaming from her aircraft systems. What he saw made his stomach drop. She was down to 1,500 feet altitude, airspeed fluctuating between 160 and 200 knots, and multiple warning indicators were screaming across every subsystem. hydraulic pressure dropping. Number 1, engine temperature climbing into the red. Fire warning light illuminated in the right nacelle. The A-10 was dying in midair, and Muranov was nursing it through the sky on willpower and a lifetime of training that told her never to eject while friendlies were still in contact below. Major Collins made his decision in the space between heartbeats. All stations, this is Warhorse Actual. We have a crippled aircraft in the combat area. I want emergency response pre-positioned at Kandahar Airfield. Crash crews on standby. And get me a real-time feed from any asset with eyes on that valley. He released the transmit button and added quietly, to no one in particular, "Come on, Katia. Bring it home." In the observation post, the forward air controller watched through his spotting scope as the A-10 emerged from the valley like something from a nightmare. Even from 3 kilometers away, he could see the damage. The entire right side of the fuselage was torn open, metal skin peeled back in jagged strips that fluttered in the slipstream. One of the engines was trailing black smoke that painted a horizontal contrail across the pristine Afghan sky. The vertical stabilizers, both of them, were peppered with holes large enough to see daylight through. "Jesus Christ," the controller whispered, "she's flying a Cullender." The Marines around him had stopped what they were doing. They stood in silence, watching the crippled warplane claw its way toward friendly airspace. Every man there understood what they were witnessing. That aircraft should have fallen from the sky already. The fact that it was still flying represented something beyond mechanical possibility. It was will made manifest. Inside that dying warthog, Katia Muranov fought a battle that would never make any official report. Her left side was on fire with pain that suggested broken ribs, possibly a punctured lung. Something warm ran down her face and into her oxygen mask, blood from a scalp wound she couldn't remember receiving. Her right hand maintained a death grip on the stick while her left worked the throttles with the delicate touch of a safecracker. The aircraft was responding, but only barely. Like trying to steer a shopping cart with 3 wheels through a hurricane. She couldn't talk. Something had happened to her throat when the cockpit had filled with metal fragments, but she could still fly. That was the thing they never understood about her, about why she'd fought so hard to get into the A-10 community despite the skepticism. This aircraft was never about grace or speed. It was about refusing to quit, about taking punishment that would shred any other plane and still completing the mission. The heads-up display flickered, died, came back. Altitude reading, 1,000 feet. She needed to gain altitude, needed to clear the mountain range between here and Kandahar. But the right engine was screaming protest through every increasing throttle input, and the hydraulic system was down to 30% pressure. The flight controls felt like moving through concrete. Katia did what she'd been trained to do. She made calculations. Distance to Kandahar, 62 nautical miles. Current airspeed, 170 knots. Time to base, approximately 22 minutes. Fuel remaining, enough. Barely. Hydraulic fluid, not enough. She was flying on borrowed time and she knew it. But the convoy below had broken contact. The Marines were moving to safety. Mission accomplished. That was worth dying for, if it came to that. She keyed the radio twice more, hoping someone would understand what she couldn't say. Then Katia pointed the nose of her disintegrating aircraft toward home and focused everything she had left on the single task of keeping it in the air for 22 more minutes. Major Collins watched the telemetry data with the focused intensity of a doctor monitoring vital signs during surgery. Every fluctuation in airspeed, every wobble in altitude, every warning indicator that flashed from yellow to red told him a story about the battle Muranov was fighting alone in that cockpit. Around him, the operations center had gone quiet. Word had spread. Officers from other departments had filtered in, standing along the walls, watching the screens. No one spoke. They just watched that blue icon crawl across the tactical display. "She's losing hydraulics," the systems officer said softly. "Down to 20%, sir. At that pressure, she won't have full control authority." Collins knew. Everyone there knew. The A-10 was designed with triple redundant hydraulic systems and could theoretically fly on manual reversion if everything else failed. But manual reversion meant muscle-powered flight controls, meant fighting against aerodynamic forces that could pin a pilot's hands in place during high-speed maneuvering. Muranov was maintaining 170 knots through damaged airframe, probably fighting with both hands and both feet just to keep the wings level. The tactical display updated. Her altitude dropped 50 feet, then recovered, then dropped again. She was struggling. Collins made another decision. Get me a straight line to Kandahar Tower. I want the longest runway cleared, every barrier cable deployed and foam standing by. He paused. And tell them she's coming in hot. She won't have enough hydraulic pressure for landing gear. The operations officer looked up sharply. Sir, has she indicated gear problems? She hasn't indicated anything. She can't talk, but look at these numbers. Collins tapped the screen. Hydraulic pressure this low, she'll be lucky if the gear extends at all, and even if it does, she won't have enough pressure for brakes. She's going to belly in or ride it out until the aircraft stops itself. Someone in the back of the room said what everyone was thinking. Either way, that's a crash landing. No, Collins said firmly. It's a controlled arrival, and Muranov has done impossible things before. She'll do one more. The room fell silent again, except for the quiet murmur of radio traffic and the steady ping of radar returns. On one of the screens, a drone feed showed the A-10 from above, and the image confirmed what the telemetry suggested. The aircraft looked like it had flown through a shredder. The right engine was completely obscured by smoke. Long strips of aluminum skin trailed from the fuselage like ribbons. The tail section was so perforated it looked like lace. Major Collins stared at that image and thought about the first time he'd flown with Katia Muranov. They'd been practicing close air support in the Nevada desert, and she'd made a comment that stuck with him. The A-10 isn't pretty, she'd said over the intercom. It's not fast or elegant, but it's honest. It does exactly what it's built to do, and it doesn't quit. I respect that. Looking at her aircraft now, Collins understood. She'd become what she'd always admired. Honest, unbreakable, refusing to quit even when quit was the only logical option. The blue icon continued its agonizing crawl across the screen. 15 miles from Kandahar now. Collins did the math. 8 more minutes. Just 8 more minutes. Come on, bookworm, he whispered. Bring it home. At Kandahar Airfield, the crash crews were already positioned along the runway. Foam trucks idled at strategic intervals, their crews standing by. The tower had cleared all traffic within a 50-mile radius. Every eye on base was turned toward the northwestern sky, scanning for the first glimpse of the wounded warthog. The tower supervisor had been doing this job for 23 years. He talked down pilots with engine failures, guided aircraft with blown tires, coordinated emergency landings for helicopters with tail rotor failures. But something about this felt different. Maybe it was the damage reports coming through. Maybe it was the silence from the pilot, just those occasional double clicks that confirmed she was still conscious. Maybe it was the way every service member on base had stopped what they were doing and turned toward the incoming flight path. He keyed his microphone. Hog 27, Kandahar Tower. You're cleared for emergency landing any runway. Wind is 090 at 8 knots. Barriers are deployed. We've got you. 2 clicks answered him. She'd heard she was still fighting. Hog 27, can you confirm landing gear status? 2 clicks, pause, then 3 clicks. No, she couldn't confirm, didn't know, or worse, knew the gear wouldn't deploy. The supervisor looked at his assistant. Tell the crash crews to expect a wheels-up landing, and tell them to expect fire. Then he saw it, a dark speck against the blue sky trailing a plume of black smoke that looked like a wound in the air itself. The speck grew larger, resolving into the distinctive silhouette of an A-10 Thunderbolt. But wrong. Wounded. The smoke trail was thick and oily, and even from this distance he could see the aircraft's flight path was unstable, small corrections and overcorrections. the mark of a pilot fighting for every second of controlled flight. "I've got visual," he said into the radio. "Hog 27, you're looking good." It was a lie, but the right kind of lie. The kind that told a struggling pilot they weren't alone. 2 more clicks, softer this time, weaker. Inside the cockpit, Kadia's world had contracted to a tunnel. Everything outside the immediate task of flying had become background noise. The pain in her chest was background noise. The blood obscuring her left eye was background noise. The shrieking warning tones and flashing lights were background noise. All that existed was the feel of the stick in her right hand, the throttles under her left, and the impossible challenge of keeping this dying machine in the air for just a few more minutes. She could see Kandahar now. The airfield sprawled across the desert like a mirage heat shimmer making the runways dance. She needed to descend, needed to configure for landing. But when she reached for the landing gear handle, her left arm wouldn't respond properly, wouldn't move with enough force to pull the lever. She tried again, gasping behind her oxygen mask, and felt something tear in her chest. Broken ribs, definitely, maybe worse. The gear stayed retracted. She was coming in wheels up. Kadia accepted this with the same cold calculation she'd applied to everything else in the last 20 minutes. Wheels up meant more damage to the aircraft, meant sliding along the runway on the belly, sparks and fire and catastrophic structural failure. But it also meant one less system to worry about, one less thing that could fail at the wrong moment. She adjusted her approach angle, lined up with the runway. The A-10 shuddered beneath her, and the right engine chose that moment to quit entirely. The turbine noise died, replaced by the wind scream of unpowered flight. Now she was gliding. A 10-ton glider with the aerodynamics of a brick, dropping toward the runway at a rate that left no room for second chances. Major Collins watched the final approach on the drone feed. His hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Around him, the operations center was silent as a tomb. Every person there understood they were watching something that would be talked about for years, either as a miracle or a tragedy. The A-10 was barely maintaining altitude. The nose was too high, indicating she was on the edge of a stall. One engine dead, the other smoking badly. Hydraulics gone. No landing gear. And somewhere in that wreckage of a cockpit, a pilot who'd already pushed past the limits of human endurance. "She's not going to make it," someone said quietly. Collins didn't respond, couldn't respond, because he was thinking the same thing. The mathematics were brutal. She was too slow, too low, too damaged. The runway was still 2 miles away and the aircraft was sinking like a stone. Then Kadia did something that would be studied in flight schools for the next decade. She dropped the nose, let the aircraft fall, used gravity itself as an engine, trading altitude for airspeed. The A-10 accelerated in the dive, the working engine screaming as it dragged the dead one through the air. She was sacrificing height she couldn't afford to lose, gambling everything on a final burst of speed that might carry her to the runway. The maneuver worked. Airspeed climbed past 200 knots, the aircraft steadied, and then the runway threshold flashed beneath her wings. She pulled back on the stick, flaring for landing. The nose came up, the tail dropped, and Hog 27 hit the concrete belly, first with a sound like the world ending. Sparks erupted in a fountain as metal met runway. The A-10 skidded sideways, one wing digging into the ground, correcting, digging again. The friction was enormous, trying to flip the aircraft, trying to tumble it end over end. But Kadia held the stick centered, fought against every instinct to overcorrect, and let the aircraft find its own equilibrium. The crash cruise launched into motion. Foam sprayed across the runway, coating the sliding aircraft in white suppression blanket. The A-10 kept going, trailing fire and metal fragments, carving a scar into the runway that would take weeks to repair. 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet, still sliding, still disintegrating. The tail section separated completely, tumbling away in a shower of debris. The right wing folded, collapsed, tore free. And finally, mercifully, the forward fuselage came to rest 3,000 feet down the runway. surrounded by foam and smoke and the wailing sirens of emergency vehicles. For 5 seconds nothing moved. The world held its breath. Then the canopy blew. The explosive charges fired, and the transparency sailed away from the aircraft, tumbling across the foam-covered concrete. And Katia Muranov pulled herself out of the cockpit with her one working arm, rolled over the side of the fuselage, and collapsed onto the wing root that had somehow remained attached to the aircraft. The crash crews reached her 20 seconds later. Medics swarmed the wreckage, hands already moving with practiced efficiency. They rolled her onto a backboard, secured her neck, started calling out vitals, but Katia was conscious. Bloody, broken, but conscious. Her eyes tracked their movements. Her good hand came up, shaking, and gave a weak thumbs up. In the operations center 16 miles away, Major Collins sat down hard in the nearest chair. Around him, the room erupted. Cheering, applause, people embracing. Officers who hadn't shown emotion in decades were wiping their eyes. Collins just stared at the screen, at the image of medics loading Muranov into an ambulance. Then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that comes from witnessing something impossible become real. "Bookworm," he said to himself, "you magnificent, stubborn, impossible woman." The medics would later report that Katia Muranov had sustained 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, a concussion, multiple lacerations, and severe trauma to her larynx from metal fragments. She'd flown that aircraft for 23 minutes while unable to breathe properly, unable to speak, in pain that should have caused unconsciousness. She'd made decisions and executed maneuvers that required clarity of thought most people couldn't manage on their best day. And she'd brought the aircraft home, not because it was possible, but because the Marines on the ground needed her to. The story spread through military channels with the speed of wildfire. By evening, every A-10 pilot in theater knew the details. By the next day, the story had reached the Pentagon. Within a week, the flight recorder data had been analyzed, the damage assessment completed, and the preliminary reports filed. The aircraft was a total loss, every major system destroyed or compromised. According to the engineers, it should never have left the valley where it was hit, should never have maintained flight, should definitely never have made it back to base. But it had, because Katia Muranov had willed it so. Major Collins visited her in the hospital 3 days after the incident. She was propped up in bed, still intubated, unable to speak. But her eyes were alert, tracking him as he entered the room. He pulled up a chair, sat down, and looked at her for a long moment. "You know they're going to pin a medal on you," he said. "Something shiny, maybe more than one." She rolled her eyes. The gesture was so perfectly Katia that Collins laughed. "Yeah, I know, you don't care about medals." He leaned forward. "But you need to understand something. What you did up there, that wasn't just flying, that was art. That was proving something every one of us believes but can never quite articulate. That the aircraft doesn't matter as much as the pilot. That will can overcome physics. That some people just refuse to quit, no matter what the universe throws at them." Katia's good hand moved slowly to the notepad on her bedside table. She picked up a pen, wincing with the effort, and wrote something in shaky letters. Then she held it up for Collins to read. "Convoy safe." Collins felt his throat tighten. "Yeah, Katia, convoy's safe, all personnel accounted for, 0 casualties because of you." She nodded once, satisfied. Then she wrote something else. "When can I fly?" Collins did laugh then, though it came out slightly choked. "Doctors say 6 months minimum, but knowing you, you'll be back in a cockpit in 4. She smiled around the intubation tube, wrote again. 3. He shook his head, still smiling. 3 months, right. I'll tell maintenance to have a bird ready." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Collins stood, started to leave, and paused at the door. "Hey, Katia, that call sign, Bookworm, I know you never liked it. Some of the guys are saying we should change it, something cooler, something that fits better after all this." She picked up the pen again, wrote for several seconds, held up the notepad. "Bookworm is fine. Let them underestimate." Collins read it twice, understanding dawning. She'd been underestimated her entire career. The female pilot who asked too many questions. The one who studied manuals instead of telling war stories in the bar. The one who was too cautious, too analytical, too something to excel in the chaotic violence of close air support. And she'd used that underestimation as a weapon. Let them think she was just a bookworm, just a technician, then prove them wrong when it mattered most. "Bookworm it is," Collins said, "but just so you know, nobody's underestimating you anymore." After he left, Katia lay back against her pillows and stared at the ceiling. Her entire body ached with a depth that suggested the pain would be her companion for months. But she was alive. The Marines were alive. And somewhere on this base, despite the damage, despite the impossible circumstances, an A-10 Thunderbolt had proved once again that it was the toughest aircraft ever built. She closed her eyes and let herself drift toward sleep, thinking about the moment when she'd keyed the radio for the last time before landing. Those 2 clicks that meant I understand. I'm still here. I'm not giving up. In the A-10 community, there's an unwritten rule that the aircraft chooses the pilot as much as the pilot chooses the aircraft. You don't fly the Warthog because it's glamorous or fast or pretty. You fly it because you understand what it represents. Stubbornness, resilience, the willingness to take punishment and still complete the mission. The refusal to be anything other than exactly what you're designed to be, regardless of what anyone thinks. Katia Muranov understood that better than anyone. 3 months later, she stood on the flight line at Kandahar Airfield, watching maintenance crews prep an A-10 for her return flight. The doctors had cleared her for light duty only. She'd ignored them. Major Collins had insisted she take another month of recovery. She'd ignored him too, because there were pilots in the air right now who needed close air support and convoys on the ground who needed someone watching over them, and she'd spent 3 months doing nothing while other people took those risks. The crew chief approached her, grinning. "She's all yours, Sergeant, fresh from depot maintenance. New engines, new hydraulics, new everything. Probably the cleanest bird on this whole base." Katia ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the smooth metal beneath her palm. No bullet holes, no shrapnel scars, no stories yet. She'd change that. "What about my old bird?" she asked. Her voice was still rough, still damaged from the throat injury. The doctors said it would never fully heal. She'd sound like this forever now, raspy, strained, like someone who'd swallowed broken glass. She thought it suited her just fine. The crew chief's smile faded. They trucked what was left to the boneyard, stripped for parts. Not enough left to salvage, really, but he hesitated. "Some of us saved a few pieces, thought maybe you'd want them." He handed her a small metal plate, twisted and perforated with holes. Part of the fuselage skin from the right side, the side that had taken the brunt of the damage. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the jagged edges, the heat-warped metal. "Thanks," she said quietly. The crew chief nodded, then headed back to his tools. Katia tucked the metal plate into her flight suit pocket and looked up at the new aircraft. It waited for her, pristine and perfect, ready to prove itself. She climbed into the cockpit, settled into the seat that had been adjusted exactly to her specifications, and began her pre-flight checks. The familiar ritual calmed her. Master switch on, radios up, hydraulics pressure check, everything green, everything perfect. Major Collins appeared below the cockpit, looking up at her. "You sure about this?" "Never been more sure of anything," she said. Her damaged voice crackled through the helmet mic. "They've got you scheduled for a milk run. Basic CAP over friendly territory. Nice and easy for your first flight back." Katia smiled. "Sounds perfect." But they both knew the truth. There were no milk runs in Afghanistan, no safe flights, no easy days, just the mission and the aircraft and the pilot's skill holding it all together. Collins stepped back, gave her a salute. "Good hunting, bookworm." She returned the salute, closed the canopy, and fired up the engines. The twin turbofans spooled up with that distinctive howl that made A-10 pilots smile and enemy forces dive for cover. She taxied to the runway, completed her final checks, and waited for tower clearance. Hog 27, you're cleared for takeoff. Hog 27 rolling. She advanced the throttles smoothly, felt the aircraft accelerate, felt that perfect moment when the wings found purchase in the air, and the weight lifted from the landing gear. She rotated, climbed, watched Kandahar airfield fall away beneath her wings. And Katia Muranov flew. The radio traffic was routine at first. Position reports, airspace deconfliction, weather updates. But then the familiar call came through. Ground forces in contact. Troops pinned down by accurate fire. Air support requested. Katia's response was immediate. This is Hog 27. Send coordinates, I'm inbound. There was a pause on the other end. Then the forward air controller's voice came back, tight with stress. Hog 27, authenticate bookworm. She smiled at that. Even now, even after everything, they needed to make sure it was really her, that the legend was real. Authenticated, send the coordinates. Copy bookworm. Grid November Bravo 864321. Friendlies marked with IR strobes. Hostiles in tree line, danger close. Danger close, meaning the enemy was so near to friendly forces that any air strike risked hitting the wrong people. Meaning this required precision and nerves, and a willingness to fly low enough to see the whites of everyone's eyes. Meaning this was exactly the kind of mission A-10 pilots lived for. Katia banked hard, descended to 500 feet, and headed for the coordinates at full throttle. The landscape blurred beneath her, desert, mountains, green valleys that hid so much violence. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency. Master arm on. Gun selected. Safety off. The valley appeared ahead. She could see smoke rising from multiple points, could see vehicles scattered along a road, could see figures running for cover. Her eyes picked out the IR strobes marking friendly positions. And there, in the tree line, muzzle flashes. The enemy, thinking they were safe in the heavy vegetation. They were wrong. Katia rolled inverted, pulled through until she was diving straight at the tree line. The altitude warning tone screamed in her helmet. She ignored it, lined up the shot using instinct and training that had been forged in moments exactly like this. The pipper settled on the target. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 cannon erupted to life. 7 barrels spinning at 4,000 RPM, spitting 30mm depleted uranium rounds downrange at a rate that turned the aircraft into a flying buzzsaw. The sound was apocalyptic, a roar that could be heard for miles, that made enemies freeze and friendlies cheer. 2 seconds of firing. 60 rounds. The tree line exploded into splinters and dust. She pulled up hard, felt the G-forces slam her into the seat, felt the aircraft respond with that solid, reassuring power that told her everything was working exactly as designed. Climbed back to altitude. Circled around for another pass. Hog 27, that's good hits. Enemy fire has ceased. We're moving to secure the area. Copy, I'll hold overhead until you're clear. She circled the valley, watching the ground forces advance. Watching them move from cover to cover, professional and efficient now that the immediate threat was neutralized. This was the mission. This was what she'd fought so hard to get back to. Not glory or recognition or medals that collected dust in a box somewhere. Just this. Being overhead when someone needed her. Being the angel of death for bad guys and the guardian angel for friendlies. After 30 minutes, the ground controller called all clear. The convoy was moving again. No friendly casualties. Mission accomplished. Katia turned the A-10 toward base, climbing to cruising altitude. The sun was setting now, painting the Afghan sky in shades of orange and red that made the mountains look like they were on fire. Beautiful and terrible at the same time, like everything else about this place. Her radio crackled. Hog 27, this is Warhorse Actual. Major Collins, she smiled. Go ahead, Warhorse. Just wanted to say welcome back. The sky's a better place with you in it. She didn't trust herself to respond immediately, so she keyed the mic twice instead. 2 clicks. The same signal she'd used when she couldn't speak, when all she could do was confirm she was still fighting. I understand, I'm still here. I'm not giving up. Copy that, bookworm, Collins said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. See you on the ground. Katia flew toward the setting sun, thinking about damaged aircraft and impossible flights, and the way people grow into the legends told about them. She thought about the crew chief who'd saved a piece of her old aircraft, about the medics who'd pulled her from the wreckage, about the Marines who'd survived because she'd refused to quit. She thought about call signs and underestimation, and the power of proving people wrong not through words but through action. And she thought about tomorrow and the next mission and all the flights still to come, because this was just the beginning. One impossible flight didn't make a career. It made a reputation, and reputations had to be maintained, reinforced, proven again and again until they stopped being stories and became truth. The lights of Kandahar airfield appeared ahead. Katia began her descent, calling tower for landing clearance. The response came immediately. Hog 27, you're cleared to land any runway. Welcome home. Welcome home. As if this place, with its dust and danger and daily proximity to death, could ever be home. But maybe it was, in the way that mattered. Home was where you belonged, where your skills matched the challenge, where you could be exactly who you were meant to be without apology or explanation. She landed smoothly, taxied to the flight line, shut down the engines. The crew chief was waiting, clipboard in hand, ready for her debrief. She climbed out of the cockpit, pulled off her helmet, and let the evening air cool her sweat-soaked hair. How'd she handle? The crew chief asked. Perfect, Katia said. Absolutely perfect. He grinned. That's what I like to hear. We'll have her turned around and ready for tomorrow's flight by 0600. Outstanding. She walked toward the operations building, her damaged voice calling out greetings to other pilots heading out for night missions. They nodded to her, respect clear in their expressions. No more jokes about bookworms. No more questions about whether she had the instinct for combat. Just respect earned through blood and pain, and the kind of flying that entered military folklore before the aircraft even landed. In the ready room, someone had posted a photo of her destroyed A-10 on the wall. The image showed the aircraft from the side, revealing the full extent of the damage. It looked like something from a special effects movie. Impossible, unsurvivable, yet she'd survived it. Below the photo, someone had written in black marker, "When the aircraft is destroyed but the mission comes first." Katia studied the photo for a long moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the piece of salvaged metal the crew chief had given her. She set it on the shelf below the photo, a talisman and a reminder of what had been survived, of what could be survived, of the distance between possible and impossible, and how that distance was often smaller than anyone thought. Major Collins found her there, staring at the wall, quite a shrine they're building. It's embarrassing, she said, but without heat. It's deserved. He stood beside her, looking at the photo. You know they're writing up the whole incident for the Air Force Aviation Safety Journal, going to be required reading for every A-10 pilot in the force. Wonderful, every mistake I made, immortalized forever. You didn't make mistakes, you made decisions, the right decisions, and because of them people who should be dead are alive. He paused. That's not something to be embarrassed about. Katia didn't respond immediately. She was thinking about those 23 minutes, about the choices that had seemed so simple in the moment but which probably looked insane from the outside, about flying a dying aircraft when ejection would have been safer, about landing wheels up when she could have bilayed out and let the plane crash into empty desert. The Marines needed support, she finally said. Everything else was secondary. I know, that's why you're the best damn CAS pilot I've ever seen. Collins turned to leave, then stopped. Oh, one more thing. Remember that call sign discussion about changing Bookworm to something cooler? I remember. Well, it's spreading. Other units are hearing the story, and they've started calling you something else, behind your back mostly. He smiled. They're calling you the Guardian because you refuse to leave until everyone else is safe. Thought you should know. He left before she could respond. Katia stood alone in the ready room, processing this information. The Guardian, not bad as far as nicknames went. Better than Bookworm, at least in terms of intimidation factor. But she'd keep Bookworm as her official call sign. Let them call her Guardian in private if they wanted. Let the legend grow. But she'd remain Bookworm on the radio, on the mission boards, in the official records. Because that name reminded her where she'd started, reminded her of the skepticism and the questions and the long path to respect. Reminded her never to assume she'd arrived, never to think she'd proven enough. There was always another mission, always another pilot to train, always someone who needed the example of what could be accomplished through skill and determination and the refusal to accept limits. Katia walked out of the ready room and headed toward her quarters. Tomorrow would come early. Another mission, another chance to prove that the first time wasn't luck, that she could do it again and as many times as necessary. Because that's what Guardians did. They showed up. They stayed on station. They kept watch over those who needed watching. And they never, ever quit. The story of Sergeant Katia Muranov's flight would spread far beyond Afghanistan. It would reach pilot training schools, where instructors would use it to teach emergency procedures and crew resource management. It would reach Pentagon briefing rooms, where generals would reference it during discussions about aircraft survivability and pilot training standards. It would reach online forums where aviation enthusiasts would debate the technical details and argue about whether the telemetry data was exaggerated. But the people who really understood the story were the ones who'd been on the ground that day. The Marines in the convoy who'd watched her make that final gun run before going silent. The forward air controller who'd heard those 2 clicks confirming consciousness. The crash crews who'd pulled her from the wreckage. The crew chief who'd examined the destroyed aircraft and realized that every single critical system had failed except one, the pilot's will. They understood that this wasn't a story about an aircraft. It was a story about a person who decided that some things were worth more than personal safety, that the mission mattered more than the risk, that protecting others was the highest calling a warrior could have. And in understanding that, they'd found something worth believing in. Not a superhuman feat of impossible heroism, but a very human decision to keep fighting when fighting seemed pointless, to keep trying when success seemed impossible, to refuse defeat even when defeat was the logical outcome. That was the real story of Hog 27, not the damaged aircraft or the dramatic landing or even the survival against odds. It was the decision, made over and over again throughout those 23 minutes, to prioritize others above self. That decision rippled outward. Pilots flew with more courage, knowing that someone had survived worse. Ground forces called for air support with more confidence, trusting that the Guardian overhead would stay until the job was done. Young officers joined the A-10 community, hopping to learn from the legend, hopping to absorb even a fraction of that competence and dedication. And somewhere in all that inspiration and aspiration, Katia Muranov continued flying, continued training, continued proving that excellence wasn't a moment but a commitment renewed daily. She flew missions that never made headlines, saved lives that never knew they'd been in danger, and slowly built a career that would span decades rather than deployments. Years later, when she was finally too old to fly combat missions and they made her an instructor, she would stand in front of classes of new A-10 pilots and tell them the truth that nobody wanted to hear. That famous flights were flukes, that what mattered was the 1,000 unremarkable missions flown with skill and professionalism, that glory was a distraction from the real work of mastering your craft. But she would also tell them, in her damaged voice that never quite healed, that when the moment came, when everything went wrong and the choices narrowed to impossible or more impossible, they would discover reserves they never knew they had, that the aircraft would give them everything it had, and they would give everything in return, and somehow that exchange would be enough. The A-10 doesn't quit, she would say, and neither do we. That's the contract. That's what we sign up for when we strap into these machines. We stay, we fight, we bring everyone home. And her students would nod, thinking they understood. But understanding, she knew, only came when you were alone in a dying aircraft with friendlies counting on you and every logical calculation screaming that you should eject. Understanding came when you made the choice to stay anyway. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. That was the story that would outlive the aircraft and the pilot and even the war itself. The story of someone who'd been underestimated and ignored and doubted, who turned all that skepticism into fuel, who'd proven that the sky belonged to anyone brave enough and stubborn enough to claim it. The sergeant went silent on the radio. Minutes later, her A-10 crawled home riddled with holes. And in between those two moments lived a truth about courage and competence, and the power of refusing to quit that would echo through military aviation for generations to come. Not because it was an impossible story, but because it was a true one.